Like I said, my name's Ed Finkler. He already gave me a nice intro, which is real kind. I work at this company called Fictive, which is really cool to give me time to go here and speak, so I'm excited about that. This reminds me too much of college, and everybody's sitting up top, and it's kind of weird for me, so bear with me. I might start screaming at you to wake you up, something like that. We'll see how that goes. What? Okay. But basically, this talk is really going to cover a high-level kind of set of principles that I try to keep in mind when I'm developing applications and learning new technologies. Why listen to me? That's a good question. I'm old, relatively speaking, for a lot of you young pups who do this stuff. I've been building web stuff a long time. There's probably a couple people in this room who have time on me, and so now I'm afraid to say how. But the first web browser I used was Mosaic on HPUX, and it could not load JPEGs because it did not have the library compiled into it to decode them, and that tells you how long ago that was. I remember the excitement about Netscape Navigator 2, where it had frame support. That was exciting. Mostly over my application development stuff, server-side stuff, and things like that, I've been writing in PHP. So I've been doing PHP for like 15 years. And that is often an interesting experience in terms of managing code and managing applications, managing projects and stuff like that. And a while back, I wrote something called the MicroPHP Manifesto. And if you're super interested in reading that, you can go to microphp.org if you really want to. Which was something I wrote that was sort of a response to what I saw a few years back, which was really a preponderance of heavy full stack frameworks and a lot of emphasis and lots of effort within the community being focused on those. The idea, though, out of these principles that I'm going to talk about, and there's 4 of them, I just held up 3 fingers and said 4, is to be really just to try to be the best developer I can be in terms of gaining knowledge and being good with your craft and stuff like that. And also just being the best team member that you can be. I'm curious, how many of you work within a team to build stuff? All righty, so how many of you do not work with a team? You just do solo stuff, predominantly, so 1 or 2. So the vast majority of you work within a team. I will tell you, even if you work solo, you do work in a team because your team is, the other person on your team is you 3 months from now. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But when the client calls and says, this doesn't work, then you can't remember how it did work ever. And that's, yeah, because that happens to me a lot. So there's really 4 principles that go into this. And the first one that I have that really deals with trying to pick up new knowledge and new information is to learn languages and not frameworks. And I've had the opportunity, I'm really glad I've had this opportunity, to learn a few different languages and really utilize them in long-term stuff. And I start off with PHP, and I also, I've dabbled a tiny little bit with Java. I don't know if everybody remembers or knows it, it's still around, this thing called Real Basic, which actually started off in like Mac OS, like Classic. And I built a couple GUI applications with that for OS X. So other than PHP, I've done a lot of JavaScript programming and a lot of Python programming now in the past couple of years. So I've had a lot of experience doing those things. And I like PHP, and I like Python, and I like JavaScript. I don't mention Real Basic there, and I like making things in PHP and Python and JavaScript. I like doing that. And I would say distinctly, I'm not a jQuery developer, and I'm not a Symfony developer. I'm not a Django developer. And those things all have their use, and they're all valuable and useful tools. But the concern I have, and what I often see with a lot of folks who sort of start off their development process or learning about, say, a new language, and their intro to it is a heavy framework, is a heavy full stack framework, is that the problem I see with that is that if you end up only really learning how that framework works and how you do things with that. And if you only know how to use that one thing within that sort of larger area of, say, the entire language, like the entirety of PHP or the entirety of Python and stuff that's available to you, the entirety of JavaScript, I think your options for using the right tool for the job, in capital title case, that gets pretty limited. If all I know are those tools, if all I know is a tool like, well, you know what, I know I write Python stuff, but really all I know is I make Django apps. Well, your options get limited really quickly, and you end up kind of saying, well, I'm going to use Django for everything from, I'm going to build my API in Django, or I'm going to figure out how to use Django to generate static sites that I upload to S3 so they're super fast and things like that. And the same thing goes with PHP. If all I know is how to use, say, Zen Framework 1, or all I know is how to use Symfony, or all I know how to use is Cake or something like that, you end up kind of using that for every single thing that you know. And I think that's particularly a problem if flexibility and performance are major concerns. I think you can kind of get away with that if you're making small internal apps that maybe 10 people worry about, and performance isn't a big issue. But it tends to be that the nature of full stack frameworks, especially full stack frameworks that are built with the intent on getting other developers to use them, they're not sort of an internal thing or something like that, they want to attract as many people as possible to the project, to use the project and get people excited about it. And then maybe they'll have conferences about it, and the guy who made it can be a keynote speaker, and he'll get hired as a consultant and stuff like that. And believe me, that's a concern of people. That's one reason they do stuff like this. And with that complexity, boy, I really lost my train of thought there. Has that ever happened to you? Yeah. Full stack frameworks. Anyway, one of the things that comes along with that complexity of full stack frameworks is really this: you have these complex architectures and these complex nomenclatures. And they're ones that often don't carry over to other frameworks and other tools and things like that. And that can be really problematic. Again, getting back, versatility and flexibility. My experience has been that I become a better and a more versatile programmer and able to adapt to more situations, to solve more problems more efficiently when I focus on learning a language first. I focus on, I'm going to learn the basic syntax, and what are the basic things that I do without having a bunch of helper libraries and stuff like that. Okay, well, how would I do this, and how do I do that? And, if I learn a framework first, particularly what I would call a full stack framework, and again, the examples of that would be something like full stack Symfony, full stack Cake PHP, Rails, Django. I think it often leads to these kind of plug and pray situations where you have a case where it's like, well, what I know is how to build, I built this stuff all in this, and so I hope there's an add-on that the community has developed that will essentially do that for me, and I'll figure that out. Shoot, if you're talking full stack frameworks, you could throw in things like Drupal or WordPress or Joomla or things like that, and I think you see that even more so there. Is that there's a tendency to kind of well, I hope that there's a plugin or some kind of add-on that does the functionality that I want, and then I'll find that and I plug it in, and it seems to work, and okay, I'm good. And that's the tendency. I'd rather personally spend my time learning more about the language itself and knowing that the skills that I'm going to apply are the skills that I'm going to learn are going to apply to anything I build in the language, no matter what I use. So if the situation calls for something like, Django would be a really good solution for this, or Symfony would be a really good solution for this, or Drupal would be a really good solution for this, then that's appropriate, and I can go ahead and take that. But if it doesn't call for one of those things, I'm still capable of sussing out what's going to be the best solution for that. The second thing we're going to talk about is this idea of building small things, and I think that's really important. I think that Laura Thompson talked about the idea of building the simplest solution possible, and then kind of, if it doesn't work, toss it out, and toss out all the crap that doesn't have anything to do with that. Well, that's kind of what I'm talking about. In general, I find that small things are good. I think it's easier to understand small things, small pieces of code, small little machines. And I always imagine, somebody said this explained a lot to them, that I always imagine when I'm programming, that really I'm building little machines that do stuff for me. They take input, they spit out output, and I tie them together and I make something, I make some larger set of things that accomplishes some set of similar tasks for people to use. It is much easier to deal with simpler machines and simpler pieces of code and simpler applications. It's easier to understand and it's harder to screw it up. I think it's really important that you focus on building small things with simple purposes. And when doing that, that's partly the implementation, but also partly how you think about it. Are you breaking down the problem to its lowest level possible? Like, okay, I need to do this. I need to get some information from here into a database, and then I also need to be able to get information out of the database back to, say, a web browser. And I build on that, like, I accomplish something that does that very basically. And then I build upon that to like make it usable by humans and not mentats and things like that. So I don't try to make, say, a single piece of my code or a single, however you want to describe it, a module of code or whatever. I don't try to make that do too much. I want to have it have simple purposes that are, if it's a few different things, they're very similar to each other. And that they solve single problems. They should be self-contained pieces to solve single problems. And those things work together and they solve bigger problems. So the idea is that each piece should work together with those other pieces to accomplish bigger things. There's a couple of key things here. I think fixing bugs is easier because you can look at each individual piece and see what it's doing. It is, I'll get to this later, but it is easier to test things like that. If they are like pieces, little components that are self-contained, you can pass in stuff, you can run some tests to ensure that it seems to work the way that you expect it to work, and you can pass that out. And the more that you can isolate that stuff down, it becomes easier to verify your expectations about that. So that's the other thing, verifying that code is easier. It's one thing about bugs that are like typos or just obvious mistakes or things like that. But it's another thing where if you have code and you're like, I'm still going to set you free code and now I'm going to deploy you and you're going to run ahead and things that goes ahead. And I'm not probably going to pay attention to you for a few months. Even if you're the person who has to come back to it later, you're probably if you're able to write tests around that kind of thing or some kind of thing that makes sure that your expectations are being met, it's a lot easier to do that with those small pieces. And something that people have talked about a lot are components, and components are really, really great. And other languages, fortunately, like Python and Ruby and even Perl, to some extent with CPAN and things like that, they all have really nice cultures of pretty solid component libraries, discovery of those components and things like that. I would say that PHP has not really adopted that until recently. And I personally think that is because of the Composer tool. And I think the Composer tool and the culture around the Composer tool emphasizes building high-quality libraries, high-quality code components that are interoperable, that don't make too many assumptions about how things are going to work, that are not tightly coupled to a certain way of working and a certain nomenclature that you have to understand, a certain intellectual sort of structure. And that is how we did stuff 3-4 years ago up until more recently, where people started saying, you know what, maybe I would like to not download the entire, say, ZF1 framework or the entire CakePHP framework or things like that. And maybe really what I need is just like a thing that routes some stuff and something that can talk to a database and something that can verify, it can do validation, and that's it. And maybe that's all you really need for your application to do. So when I'm talking about components, I think a really good example of that is this is my shout out to my friend Paul, and his Aura project I think is really good, AURA. And I think it is a really good example of building separate components that can be combined into a framework if you choose to do so, but don't have to, and you can pick and choose that stuff. And I think it's great because Composer lets you pick and choose those things very easily, include them in your project, know exactly what's coming in, and just utilize what you want to utilize. And I think that's really appealing. So, the third piece of this is that I really strongly feel that less code is better than more. You got more code, more problems. That's what Biggie said, and I tend to agree with him. I think it's important that you try to manage less code. Bigger code bases, just lines of code, a number of files, a number of nested folders and stuff like that. Bigger code bases are harder to manage. Now, some people have different thresholds for like what is hard for them to manage. Some people can handle, it's like, this is 500 separate files and I'm cool with that. That is not a problem. And this file is 2,000 lines of code, but it is really not a big deal for me. I don't have a problem with that, that's fine. I tend to have problems with like things where it's a lot of visual noise and there's a lot of like digging around and stuff like that. And there's sort of like I have a certain, buffer that I have in my head of like the number of things I can keep track of at one time, right? And people are different about that. But for me, I know that if files start getting a little bit too long, it gets harder for me. I have to start using search tools even within the file to find stuff. I have to use things like code folding to basically remove visual noise so that I can just focus on the piece that I'm focusing on. And that intellectually makes it easier for my brain to focus on that project right then, or focus on that piece right then. Whereas if it's surrounded by a bunch of other stuff, I have trouble with that. So what I find with these larger code bases, as it gets bigger, navigating through complex file structures takes longer. If you have a big nested thing or something, and sometimes you balance that out with, well, there's a naming scheme, and we kind of want to be consistent with that, and you end up nesting sometimes things that's like, well, that's kind of a lot. Like I have 3, that seems like a lot, but like 3 or 4 levels. And I don't want to do that, but sometimes you kind of do because you want to be consistent. And keeping all that straight in your brain kind of gets challenging. I've seen some people say that, I saw one project where, I think it was a JS project, where the guy said, well, if something gets over 200 lines of code, it's kind of unwieldy, so you should really split things out. Now, 200 lines, that's kind of hard. I have often tried to do that, and what I find is that as I actually take a project and actually do stuff with it and keep adding on stuff that I'm supposed to add on so it becomes the application that is envisioned, it is difficult to stick to that. But being conscious of that, I think, is useful. I think the second thing is that you get to support less code, and you really, really, really want to support less code. And this is a key thing, and it gets at, I'm going to have a drink of coffee here for a second. It gets at something that I think you can run in even when you have package management systems, or package management systems even can lead to it more, but I think it was more problematic if your idea with PHP development 5 years ago, which was downloading a zip file with a big framework and dropping this giant blob somewhere in your include path, and that was where things set up, right? If your application is using it, you have to support it. And that means every single line of code that is being included in your application. And I think that's a really important thing to consider, to think about, that every single line of code that you choose to include in your application now becomes your responsibility. So what that comes from is there's a couple different levels that can be. There could just be bugs in the code. There's going to be bugs in the code. There are always bugs in the code, and that's fine. And sometimes those bugs are going to kind of bite you in the ass. I've rarely found a case where I was not working with something for a long time and didn't run into some bug that caused some kind of problem, and I was like, well, because I want to do something like this, because the people who were sort of designing the application said, well, what would be cool is if it flipped around, and if we were at this point, then it went like that, and zipped me through this URL, and it's like, oh, this isn't really how it's supposed to work. This is going to be a pain. And then so I have to get into like the guts of the system and figure out, okay, well, how does it actually match things for routes, and how does it actually do this and that? Because they wrote it some kind of magic crap that's all abstracted, and I can't figure out how the old stuff works, so now I have to take a step debugger and step through everything. Does everybody here use step debuggers? How many of you don't? Paul doesn't count because he can probably do anything he wants to without it. So a couple of you don't use step debuggers. Several of you didn't raise your hands, which means you're not listening. I'm going to kill you. No, it's not true. It's not true. I'll just scream louder. But what I've found is that using step debuggers is one of the ways. I've had to like decompose, not in the first definition, but maybe the second definition of decompose, a lot of different projects, a lot of like proprietary framework stuff that people build in-house, because that's what PHP developers do, is they build their own frameworks. And so I've been brought in on a lot of like contract stuff where I came and had to figure out how stuff worked, and I often find that using a step debugger is one of the best ways to understand how the code flows. But you could also say that if I have to use a step debugger to figure out how your code works, then there is a problem with your code fundamentally. That it should not be that hard to figure it out. It should not be that hard to trace the execution path from here's where you have an index.php file, and maybe your Nginx or Apache is doing some redirects so you have nice URLs, but otherwise you can see where this stuff kicks off, and it should be easy to trace from here to here to here. And you know, if it touches 75 different files when you're doing just the execution of one request response, there better be a good reason for it. I guess I should say that. So I was saying, there's always going to be bugs inside of code, and you're going to run into stuff, and it's like, oh man, this is just really hard to figure out how this works, and I don't understand how this, you know, why it's not behaving the way that I expect. So you end up having to spend a bunch of time doing that. Well, you've inherited that code because you made the choice to include that in your project. Whether it was a conscious choice or not, you chose to say, I'm going to download this whole framework. Or I'm going to go ahead and download, you know, or you can do this with Composer. I'm going to download this with Composer, and it has, you know, has a list of like required libraries that's based on that's like 20 long. Well, you have inherited now your personal maintenance of all of those libraries too. And the bigger area I think it gets into is security. You now become responsible for any security flaws that are in that. So how many of you have ever used WordPress before? And how many of you, say, have ever installed a theme or a plugin for WordPress? That's a pretty common thing. It comes shipped with like 8,000 themes because who doesn't need that many, right? Okay, so this was a few years back. And this is really not a criticism of WordPress itself, but it is something to consider when we are including things. Including code in our things without really being aware of it. Now there was a few years back, there was this popular thing that got used in a bunch of themes, and I think it was in a bunch of different themes, and was installed on a lot of WordPress sites, and it was called TimThumb. The file was timthumb.php. So what that, has anybody heard of it? All right, so a couple of you have. So it's a few years ago. So what it would do, not surprisingly, it was used to auto-scale, it would automatically scale images to a certain size. So let's say your average user, I think, particularly if they're not super savvy with stuff, does not understand the concept of like scaling images and the differences between like pixel sizes and file sizes and stuff like that, because that's actually really complex and we all think it's just normal. Of course you got it, it's fine because we've been doing this for 10, 15 years, and of course it's obvious, but to normal human beings it's not. And so this plugin would let you pass things to a certain, like you say, okay, pass it to TimThumb and pass an argument as like a URL. And grab this URL over here that was an image, and scale it down so it's only like 640 by 480 and that way it will be nicely sized, and you're not loading like a 5 megapixel image inside of a post, which happens all the time if you've ever worked with anyone who's used a content management system. So that is a problem that has really never been solved as far as I can tell. There are no good solutions for it. They're all hard, and you have to train people, and it's complex. So this was, it makes sense people want to do this. Okay, so the guy who wrote this, PHP does not have a, like it has a pretty shallow learning curve, and you can be productive in it pretty fast. So this guy who wrote this, perhaps Tim is his name, he wrote this plugin, and when Tim, let's call him that, worked on it, he put together a thing where he tried to do the right thing, where it would like, you're supposed to have a set of whitelisted URLs that it would come from, like domains. It's like, only try to pull from these domains, because otherwise, well, then it could pull, if you just let it pass arbitrary URLs to everywhere, well, it would pull in anything from anywhere, and then it would be super easy for anybody who just wanted to say, oh, I'm going to have your TimThumb install pull this file from any arbitrary place that I decide, right? And if you don't realize that, that is a horrible, horrible idea. It is a clear file inclusion problem and is going to screw you really super hard almost immediately. Well, so Tim had the right idea, but his execution on the whitelisting and regex matching was not really good. So what happened was, it was pretty easy to figure out how to get it so that it would include an arbitrary payload. And then it would allow people to, they could just, all they'd have to do is just type in a URL to the, that's pointed to TimThumb's on your server and then pass the argument of, okay, it looks like this, and there was something that would satisfy the regex whitelisting, but would also point to some arbitrary piece there. So now it downloads this file on your machine, and at that point, now they've been able to put arbitrary files on your machine, and it was used as a backdoor to, not a rootkit quite, because it would not get rootkit stuff, but it was a file injection thing. So it would compromise systems, and the thing was, they didn't discover it, of course, until there were literally tens of thousands of servers running Tim Thumb on it. And why did that happen? It's because nobody actually looked at what it did, and they just said, oh, this does what I want, and there's some reason for that. You want the button because that makes it easier for people to use stuff, and it makes it easier. You don't have to be like, well, okay, I'm going to empower you to do self-publishing with WordPress, but first let's talk about the HTTP, or let's talk about the FTP protocol. Let's do that. And then, okay, well, what's going to happen is that the Apache module sees the .php extension on the file, then it passes through its interpreter, and then it spits out HTML. Well, you don't want to have to spit it out. You want to have the button that goes, brr, and now you've got that on there. And that is, if you install WordPress now, it's got like a button for every plugin imaginable, and a bunch of different themes. It's like, would you like to download 8,000 more themes on your system? Brr, and then it does that for you. Okay, so it does that, and that's really great. Now, but the problem is, you have to think about who's vetting that stuff. And at that time, lots and lots of people were building stuff, but really nobody was vetting it. And things have maybe gotten a little bit better, but there's always going to be the next case where people are really excited about a burgeoning new community, a new project, and people are building lots of add-ons for it, and lots of people are excited about it. And the last thing that people do is they vet stuff. They vet it for security. That is not exciting. Nobody does that, believe me. So the responsibility is who deploys that. So there's that basic thing. And I'm curious, like, I know I don't always do a good job of this, but realistically, if you install a library, you should be checking, like, okay, well, how am I going to keep up with security updates? Like, is there a mailing list for it? Is there something like that? I don't know. Or is it just something that some dude threw up on GitHub, and I don't really know what, maybe he'll update it. I don't know. And so you run into that, but at the end of the day, you're the one who chose to put that on the server, either for yourself, which is one thing, or for somebody who paid you for this purpose. And are you really sure it's going to be secure? Well, there's probably a damn good chance that it's not secure, and you're probably going to have to fix something with it at some point, whether it's a security thing or whether it's just a bug or something like that. You take into account exposure and things like that. Is it a really super popular thing or not or whatever? But the point is that it's your responsibility above everybody else's. I mean, you're the one who, you're the shepherd in this situation. And the people who employ you or contract you to do this work or things like that, they're entrusting you to put something on there that is not going to screw them over down the road. And so if I think about it in that way, I want to be really damn sure that the stuff I'm putting on there, I have at least a pretty good idea that it is not going to screw me over. And the more code that I include, the more stuff that I throw in there, it becomes exponentially harder to do that. And then even beyond that, just, I'll get to that in a minute. I think, yeah, okay. I'll get to that in a minute. So the idea is basically that it's not the case that you should never use a large library. There are certainly times when your project might call for something like a really heavy, complex library like, say, Doctrine, which is a very complex ORM that does tons of different stuff and solves tons of problems for people who are working with relational databases. And I don't know, it probably does something else too. I don't know, it might interact with radio telescopes and talk to space aliens and crap like that. But I'm sure it does all that. But personally, most of the time it's like, I want to save things into a database and get them out. I am not just, why? I don't want to bring all that stuff in because this is all this technical debt I'm taking on. So I use lots of code that I didn't write. Sometimes people have kind of said, well, are you saying that you should never reuse code and you should always write your own stuff from materials? God, no, I'm too dumb to do that. There are lots of people who have written libraries that are much better than anything I could come up with and solve problems that I would have trouble solving. Use lots of libraries and tools that are non-trivial to understand, too. But the key thing is that you need to understand the responsibility that you take on and the technical debt that you take on. So every line of code and everything that you include in your application, whether that be an architectural issue like, well, I'm going to use this separate search system over here, like I'm going to use some Java-based search system that you interact with via an API and stuff like that. Well, that's another component that now I've included, and I have a responsibility now to maintain that because I take on more responsibility for every one of those things. So every line matters, so you have to treat it as such. Every line matters. The fourth thing, before I get to that, I need to have another drink here. I got very excited talking about Tim and the thumbs. The fourth thing I really try to do is I want to create and use simple readable code. I want code that's easy to understand. I touched on this a little bit before. So understanding things quickly means I get to get stuff done faster, and that is really great. Time to productivity is shortened, your time to fix bugs is shortened. I want code that's easy to verify. Simpler code is more testable. A key thing that I think sometimes we don't think about is that readability is a feature. This is something that has become more apparent to me. I was always kind of felt that way, and then some people were like, why do you care about that stuff? Because it didn't mean the same thing to them, because of things that like I sort of like having spaces between pieces of code in like a function. And those little, I'm the kind of person that's like, in PHP, no one gives a shit. So you'll have stuff where it's like, I'm the kind of person who will agonize for even a few seconds, agonize, I guess, but I'll spend more time than most human beings would figuring out like, oh, you know what, I just spent like 10 seconds figuring out how many spaces should be between these two, even within a function. It's not like this is a separate, not like between functions or between definitions or things like that. It's just within the function. It's like, well, I should probably put a space here because these concerns should be stuck together. But these things should be separate. But maybe I want some more space here because there's like 5 different thick lines here, and even though those things all go together, it's like that. It's me. Visual noise bothers me. It is easier for me to understand stuff that is not visually noisy. That affects me more than it probably affects some other people. But in working in Python, like Python has a whole, it's sort of like, it's a little bit like these PSR things that we do in PHP. And Python has these things called PEPs, PEPs. And Python has like 250 of them, and I think there are 4 PSRs in PHP, which might, just if you compare those, that's kind of tells you a little bit of difference about the communities. But PEPs, they're sort of like agreed upon standards that we sort of recommend that you can follow. Like you can use semicolons in Python and put multiple statements on the same line. You can totally do that. The language is capable of that. But if you use anything that checks it against PEP 8, which is basically a coding standard recommendation, again, they have PEP 8 is like, there's essentially one coding standard for Python, and there are like 70,000 for PHP. It's just different. It doesn't mean it's better or worse, it's just different. But one of the things that you get out of Python is that there's more emphasis on readability, and that is key. It's like you don't want things to go over, say, 80 lines they recommend, right? And you actually want to have this space. And they get down to like, you should have 2 spaces between where you put your import statements up here and when you start defining stuff after that. You should have 1 space between this. If you have 2 new line characters inside of a function definition, that is too many. You must have 1, right? So must is a strong word because you don't have to write, there's little tools that run these things against the PEP 8 standards. They call them linters, I'm sure you've heard that term. You can ignore them or not. You don't have to do them. But what I find is that I generally write more readable code when I use those things. So coming out of Python, I heard that term. I can't remember, Kenneth Wright is that guy's name? You wrote a really nice library called Requests, and I believe It was in a presentation he did. He said, readability is a feature. And I feel that my code should be simple and terse, but clear. And there's a balance there. Simple and terse, like I want it to be as short as possible, but it has to be clear still. I'm not gonna, it's not gonna be, I'm not gonna have single character variable names for everything, and write everything on one line, right? But it has to be clear at the same time. So a key thing is to value clarity over cleverness. There you go, yes. Clarity over cleverness. And there's lots of clever things we can try to do with PHP. And it's not as bad as, like, say, some languages try to let you get super clever. And, I guess Perl would be a good example of that. I think Ruby kind of does that too. And I'm not a huge fan of that. I like clarity. I think one of the things you have to think about is how quickly would another developer be able to understand this at first glance? And that takes some empathy because another developer is not you. Another developer does not necessarily learn the same way that you do. Another developer does not have the same comfort level that you do. They may not like the same kind of syntax coloring. They may use a different editor and they, whatever, right? How quickly is that person going to be able to grok this, understand this? So you have to think about that. And I think it's a really good exercise to actually show things to people and say, okay, can you see what's going on here? And don't tell them anything. Just stand back and say, okay, what are your questions with this? What can't you figure out? Just tell me. But I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to try to explain anything to you. And the second thing is, will I be able to understand this when I come back to it in 2 months? My usual experience is no. I'm not able to understand the code that I wrote 2 months ago. And so I have to relearn and re-remember what I did. Documentation and code blocks, and really nice for that sort of thing. So I end up wasting less time figuring out how things work, so I spend more time getting things done. And that's what I want, right? We do this stuff because we want to create things that accomplish stuff for us. And I have great joy in seeing those things work, building something and seeing it work. Well, I don't want to, I want to spend as little time as possible trying to understand it, and I want to spend more time using it to build things. And so the less time I have to spend figuring it out, more time I got to do something. This is a quote from, usually anything that says Agile in it, I start dry heaving, but this is, I thought it was a very good quote from this guy, Andy Hunt, who was, I think he was co-author actually, but maybe it was just me. Practices of an Agile Developer. And he said, when developing code, you should always choose readability over convenience. Code will be read many, many times, many, many more times than it is written. And that's absolutely true. I can't think of circumstances that hasn't been the case. I've written a few scripts here and there that I only read a couple times because I only needed to do the things once. And that I felt less compelled to do that. But if I'm part of a team, or if this is code I'm ever going to have to look at again, or I'm going to be responsible for more than, say, 6 hours, I want to make sure that I can figure out what's going on, or that somebody else is going to be able to figure out what's going on, and I don't waste their time, right? And so, that's the key thing, is that with creating short code, making it clear, and that clarity, with that clarity, I think comes simplicity. And sometimes that means not using a ternary operator or things like that, right? Little stuff like that. Now I'll say best practices vary a lot with this stuff. There are differences in languages. There are differences in libraries and tools and teams. Consistency is really, really key with code that you're going to maintain. So if you have some coding standards, some guidelines you've set up or things like that, it is really important that you stick to those, because it is going to make it easier once you understand that stuff. Well, I can apply that to other things, and now I can understand that stuff much more quickly, these other pieces of it. Implementations of these kinds of things, and implementations of the stuff that I've talked about, are entirely pragmatic. They're not doctrine. They're not, because the key is to keep these things in mind. The point is that it's not, I don't try to think about these things as a best practice stuff. Excuse me, I do think about some of the best practice stuff. But what it is it's you have to be pragmatic for what the project calls for. And different projects are going to call for different things. Some projects are going to benefit from taking a certain approach or taking certain libraries or doing this or that, and it's going to depend on a lot of things. It's going to depend on what kind of developer skills you have in-house, what kind of people you can hire, how easy is it going to be to maintain such an application? Is there a lot of documentation available for this thing or that thing? All of those things come into account, and you have to consider those when making these kinds of decisions about what technologies to adopt. And those technologies are all the way down to like what component library I use to connect to my database, or do I use to route stuff from URLs to handlers or things like that. But you want to keep those things in mind and keep pushing at that stuff. Keep pushing at simplicity. Some useful tools that I found. The first one is I really, really do like, within PHP stuff, I really like Composer and the Packagist stuff, Packagist.org, Composer, the tool to install things. I really like it because I think it's encouraging good library work and interoperable components. I like that a lot. The last PHP thing I did, I installed everything off of Composer, and I used the Slim PHP framework, which is a little micro framework that basically does session management and routing for you. And that's about it. And I got a validation library, what was it called? Respect Validator, or validation, I always forget. And Idiorm, which is an ORM, which was a little heavier than I wanted to use, but I had to write an API in a week for this thing. I would say one of the things I try to keep in mind with Composer is I look actively at what are the things that this relies on, what are the dependencies. I couldn't think of that word. What are the dependencies for the thing I'm installing? And I look at that stuff, and I look actively for things that don't have any dependencies. Because I do not want to inherit more code that I don't understand and now have to be responsible for. So that doesn't mean you should never do that. It just means that you have to justify the dependencies. Maybe there's a huge upside for using something that has a bunch of dependencies. Maybe it gains you a whole lot, and that is really, really great. But you just have to keep in mind, I'm taking on this technical debt in exchange for that. So I try to use it conservatively. I don't just throw stuff in there without reviewing those dependencies and things like that. With coding standards, in PHP, there's not an obvious, like, this is the coding standard you should use. I just pick one. Try to pick one that's probably kind of popular, I guess, that a lot of people use. Like, if your coding standard it's very, very weird and odd, that's not going to help, because that means that when you bring people onto your team, less people are going to understand what's going on because it's written in some weird way that doesn't make sense to them. It almost doesn't matter, but something that complies with like the PSR stuff, that helps, I think, a lot. I have now bent my rebellious nature to using things like the PSRO autoloaders and stuff like that. I just let Composer do that crap and don't worry about it. I think writing a lot of Python stuff calmed me down and let me accept dear leaders stuff. But the key thing is that everyone should be writing to the same standards.